Hey there, I'm Sarita, and you're about to experience the modern approach to well-being where you get to establish the best and most important relationship you will ever have, the one with yourself. I'm on a mission to help you declutter energy and reclaim your power so you can be a magnet to what you desire. If you're looking for the optimal blend of mindset and healing, you're in the right place. My goal in this podcast is to share tools, resources, and practices that will help you along your healing journey. I'm so excited to be here with you today, so welcome to Back to Here with Sarita. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Back to Here with Sarita. I'm super happy that you are here with me today. And if you are a new listener, I really appreciate you being here. There are so many different podcasts that you can be listening to. So I really appreciate you being present with me today. And if you're a returning listener, of course, I appreciate your listenership. It means the world to me. If you were catching this on YouTube, you will see that I have a different surrounding as usual. I embrace the work from anywhere lifestyle, so I get to set up my podcast. I kind of call it my traveling podcast. Get to set it up kind of wherever I am staying. And at the moment, I'm actually in a small office. So if you are listening to this on Spotify or Apple, there might be some kind of echo. So I do apologize about that. On YouTube, if you're catching this on video, I have an interesting lighting situation. I've got the natural light on my right-hand side with the window and the fluorescent light on the left-hand side. So most likely my face has some interesting contouring or shadowing going on. Regardless of the platform that you are listening or watching this episode on, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you know when episodes go live. So today we'll be talking about reclaiming my roots in order to manifest with more ease. I want to say as a disclaimer, this episode will be talking about some things that you probably won't be hearing too often on a manifestation or a spiritual podcast, and it may rustle some feathers, but I feel like it's information and topics that are pertinent to manifestation and pertinent to just having conversation. So bear with me as I attempt to articulate, what's happening and some reflections that I've had. So this episode is less about teaching as it is about just reflecting my own personal journey and the things that are coming up and things that I feel like cannot be ignored. Reclaiming my roots. If you were to put me in a box or I was requested to have some level of a label, what I would consider myself is a transracial adoptee or a Latina, more specifically a Latina transracial adoptee. For those of you that don't know what a TRA is, transracial adoptee, it's basically somebody who's adopted who has a caretaker who is of a different ethnic origin or race than themselves. So I consider myself a transracial adoptee because I was adopted from Central America by a white single mother. I immigrated to this country through international adoption. So not in the traditional way of being an immigrant with like a family member or a family. So I immigrated to this country through international adoption. Like I said, raised by a white single mother in the Midwest in the United States in a Christian religion. So if you can imagine the experience that I had growing up, I was very detached from language, food, culture, and I always felt like I was a little different, like I didn't belong. And I realize as an adult and then coming to meet other people that have had very similar experiences, people that are transracial adoptees have very similar experiences of those people that consider themselves biracial or even bicultural. I dive a lot more deep into my actual adoption journey in episodes 12 and 13. If you want to go back to 2023, I go a lot deeper into that actual journey and the impact that is caused on me as an adult. My identity has always been a very, very important part of who I am. Even in astrology, I mentioned that I'm an Aries. And so what I stand for and what I believe is very important to me. I believe that has to do with my Aries personality, the modern day warrior. I need to know what it is I stand for and what I believe in. And so when it comes to race and gender, It was something that I learned a lot more as I got into high school. I experienced definitely things growing up, being a child that was raised in a very white community. I was raised by a single mother. So I was very much exposed to race and gender growing up, but I didn't necessarily understand it. And it wasn't until high school that I started reading a lot more rhetoric around it, which actually planted some seeds and caused me to go into college with a lot more interest and ended up having a minor in sociology around race and culture. Then I dove a lot deeper into my master's degree when I went to grad school to learn a lot more about identity construction. I've been aware, obviously, of things for a very long time and how I've navigated life because based on the color of my skin and the gender that I identify with. And I always felt like I was negotiating my space in some form or way, depending on what the majority was happening in that situation. So, with things that I definitely experienced, but not necessarily understood until I started actually being aware and reading about it and understanding. So, that being said, even though I was experiencing things in the spiritual spaces and the personal development spaces, I didn't really understand it. So then I entered into the personal development and spiritual spaces, and I found it really interesting that a lot of the people that I encountered were not BIPOC. If you don't know what BIPOC means, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So I'll be utilizing that language to identify myself and people that identify as people of color. I noticed in those spaces there was big disparity of BIPOC people, unless I was going to a leadership conference specifically for Latinas, right? But if I wasn't, then most of the spaces that I would encounter, it was mostly white people. In women's circles that I would go to, in spiritual circles I would go to, in personal development communities, I found it really, really interesting, but it wasn't something that I necessarily thought really, really heavily about. It was something that I just noticed. Also, I noticed later on after I started paying attention was that I noticed the approach that I was receiving or getting in these particular spaces was very colonized or aka white, which means I felt like my experience as a BIPOC person was not taken into consideration. My background, my experience. And so it felt like what I was being taught or what I was being told was almost a watered down version, a very generalized version for everybody, and not necessarily meant for me specifically, unless I found spaces where they were specifically addressing people of my particular demographic. I felt like in those spaces, reflecting back, that my identity was very overlooked. And it felt like it was a little bit triggering because I had experienced growing up as a child in the Christian church that I went to. Some of the elders would say things like, I don't see color. I even have a recollection of one of my grandparents telling me that they didn't see color when they saw me. And so it felt like, to a certain capacity, that my identity was being bypassed. I felt like it was a way to spiritually bypass people by saying to them that they didn't see color. And so I heard that over and over again throughout my upbringing. So it was interesting in these spaces. I felt like I was having that same experience on a larger, grandiose scale, that people were not paying attention or acknowledging my own personal experience. The odd thing is that I didn't really acknowledge it or even have it be a conscious thing. Yes, these were experiences that I had growing up. These are experiences I had in personal development and spiritual spaces, but I didn't really recognize it as being something so profound that I needed to actually pay attention to it, because I was so invested in my personal development and my spiritual journey. But then something kind of interesting started to happen as I got a lot more deep into my personal development story and my journey, but my spiritual journey and my self-love journey, and unpacking a lot more of the trauma and unpacking a lot more of my worth and unpacking a lot more of the experiences that I had. What was interesting, that everything seemed to tie back to my upbringing and my roots. And then some of it actually even stemmed into my ancestry. So it was like, no matter how I looked at it, everything always seemed to come up from the past, what I experienced in the past and what I was experiencing in the present moment. And it was deconstructing those parts that I actually started to recognize that there was something a lot deeper there. And so the biggest and most profound experience, and it was the first one that I had, I realized that my worth, my worthiness story, my worthiness wound was actually tied to a lot of my value, that I experienced those two things. So, for example, I felt like I wasn't of value in certain situations because I had a worthiness wound. Where did that worthiness wound come from? It came from my own personal experiences. But then as I got a lot deeper, I found that there was a lot deeper layering there than just my own personal experiences. If you want to dive a little bit more deep into my actual worthiness journey that I unpacked and discovered, please go ahead and listen to episodes 12 and 13. I unpack a lot more of that in those episodes that released back in 2023. I'll get back into the worthiness factor because I think that's really, really important as we tie that into manifestation, but I'll circle back to that in a moment. I want to take a step back and reflect on a few years ago. If you remember, in 2020 during the pandemic, there were some pretty epic things that were happening, especially when it came to talking about race. There was a lot of people that were in very high power positions who were white that were acknowledging their white privilege. And people started to talk about things like white passing and decolonization. You even saw a handful of thought leaders and spiritual leaders and entrepreneurs actually talking about race and educating themselves. And I found it really interesting that these same leaders decided not to talk about these particular things after the buzz died down. However, there were a good handful of people that I still follow today that actually ended up pivoting the way that they talked about privilege and incorporated a lot more diversity into their teachings, which I really, really appreciate. And those are some people that I follow to this day. And so a byproduct of that was for me actually going through a manifestation coaching program that was created by somebody that decided to pivot and become a little bit more diverse. There were some modules in there that helped me understand a little bit more around my ethnic origin and my race when it came to my worth. I really appreciated that. So I didn't feel completely unseen. But it was interesting that it was just that one particular experience that I had that was helpful to me. But then when I did a leadership program back in 2023, I found myself and one of my friends, we felt very unseen because we were asked to do something in particular that made us both feel really uncomfortable when it came to the color of our skin. To this day, I don't really remember what it was, but I do remember having that conversation with him, that was a very defining moment for me, that I realized that this was something that needed to be unpacked and discovered a little bit deeper. So circling back to my worthiness journey, I have a lot of worthiness wounds, and I didn't realize that I actually shared a lot of these wounds similar to other people that are transracial adoptee, and I discovered that through my transracial adoptee groups when I joined them back in 2020. And then I started working with clients via the coaching program Launch Latinx and mentoring other Latino students and people that were going through the program and high school students, many of them who were first generation. I realized there was a lot of commonalities that we had. And also I started to coach other women that considered themselves BIPOC. And I realized there was something a lot deeper. So I got to thinking. That there's not really a lot of people who are specifically talking about that. There is a tie between how we experience life as somebody who is of color when it comes to our spirituality and more specifically, our manifestations. So bear with me as I go through this part because I'm going to be articulating, kind of thinking out loud and trying to understand this a little bit better as I tie the worthiness, manifestation, and being BIPOC together. So if our wounds are closely tied to what we experience on a singular level, meaning like what I've experienced as a person being transracial adoptee and navigating life as a person of color in a very non-color space, then what we experience on a collective level is also impacting our worth even more. So we're having this kind of duplicitous, if that's a word, experience where we're experiencing our own experience, and then we're also experiencing on a collective level with even more impact because there are people also experiencing the same thing. Stay with me as I try to unpack all this. So as a whole community of people who were colonized at one time, if we look at history, we have hundreds and hundreds of years of trauma and conditioning, right? In believing that our worth and our value is minor or less than the majority. So as we know, when it comes to things like epigenetics, which is the study of DNA and how our environment impacts the way our genes are created, and this is scientifically proven, that what we know about epigenetics from a science-based perspective, that our environment actually impacts us and our DNA. So this conditioning that we've had, right, even from a singular experience, like my lifetime experience, is not just from my childhood, but it's actually trauma stored in my body from my ancestors. This means that I carry a lot of beliefs and thoughts that are not only from the singular personal experience that I'm having here in this 3D reality, but and things that I'm experiencing on the daily and what I see daily, but also from the ancestors, also from my colonized ancestry. And so what I see on a daily basis, which is a world where people that look like myself and darker are marginalized and conditioned to believe that they are less than. And so this is impacting not only how I'm thinking and believing and operating, but it's also in my DNA and my own experiences from my ancestors and the trauma that I carry from years and hundreds and hundreds of years. When you think about this kind of stuff, or when I think about this kind of stuff, it can seem overwhelming and daunting, and it feels like nothing can change, and it seems really unfair, and it feels like there's no end to it. And then at the same time, I remember that the name of my podcast, which is Back to Here, back to the present moment, back to remembering who I actually am, remembering that I am source and that everything starts from within. And sometimes when I say things like this, sometimes when I hear things like this, when I hear come back to center or stay high vibe or just work on yourself or surrender, it makes my stomach kind of turn in a knot sometimes, because it's a challenge being who I am as a person. Again, identifying as BIPOC, a woman of color, that my experience is unique, but yet not so unique. I can fall into a level of victimhood in the way that I can hear somebody say these words and not fully understand my story and my experience, because it's different than what they've experienced, especially if that particular person isn't physically looking the same way that I do. But as I reflect on it now, I see how, and this is where the worthiness factor, and this is where tapping into my roots is helped me manifest with so much more ease. As I reflect back, and again, I've had little experiences here and there where I've found communities that do take more time to appreciate the diversity and appreciate the different stories and experiences that we have. And especially spiritual leaders that are BIPOC, and especially thought leaders that are BIPOC, that do talk about these things, because there are leaders that do identify as BIPOC that are not talking about these things. And that's okay. There's no judgment to them because I am in a space and I have a platform and I am interested in this. I have a history of being very interested in this. It behooves me to share this and to talk about this because I find it so important. And so, kind of going back to tapping into my roots, being able to get to know and reclaim my roots, it was because of the steps that I did to actually reclaim myself that I was able to manifest with more ease. It was when I joined the Transracial Adoptee group in 2020 when things started to pivot. It was when I stopped saying things like, I'm not Latina enough, is when things started to pivot. It's when I started to embrace my broken ass Spanish that things started to pivot. It was when I started that Latino business program in 2020, Launch Latinx, that things started to pivot. It was when I became a coach for Latino students for that program that things started to pivot. It was when I was a speaker for a Latina Day conference talking about spirituality and wellness that things started to pivot. It was when I started identifying myself as a Latina transracial adoptee when things started to pivot. And the cherry on fucking top, was when I went back to my birth land, my birth country, El Salvador, when things started to really, really pivot and shift. The last one was the biggest breakthrough that I personally had and I needed in this particular chapter of my life to validate me on such a deep level. And it's really hard to articulate and tell you how that actually happened. My worth just felt like it was like the missing link that I never had. And it was in episode, I don't remember which episode it was, that I talked about my journey to El Salvador. That was so transformational for me. I'll have it in the show notes for you. But as I reflect on this, come to find out that denying whole parts of who I am is actually really not great for manifestation. Meaning, the farther and farther and farther away from who you are, and I'm not necessarily saying like the spiritual part of who you are, because yes, we all are. You know, if we were to zoom out and think about this on like a 5D level, we are humans we are spiritual beings experiencing a human life, right? And there is in that way, there is no color, there is no body, there is nothingness. Like there's so much openness, right? And possibility. That's what the universe sees. That's what God sees. But if we're talking about this experience here in this 3D form, right? This reality that we're living in the human form, when we are denying the parts of us that we think are not important, it's actually blocking us from our manifestation possibility. So let's just take like race and gender out of this. Let's say you've been subjected the belief that you need to get married and have children and, do that kind of life, right? You've been subjected this belief over and over again. But yet every fiber of you just wants to live a life single, or maybe not have a partner and like adopt a child, on your own. Or maybe you have a partner and you decide not to get married, or maybe you live in separate homes. Like being authentic to who you are is super, super important. And denying parts of you that are really, really important in this lifetime are actually blocking your manifestations. I didn't realize this until I started looking. So it was when all those things that I listed that things started to change. It was when I really started to reclaim those parts of myself, reclaim my roots. That's when things started to change. And what's really fascinating is we'll bring back in this part because again, manifestation and spirituality are not new to us people of color. If we look back at history, colonizers knew this. They knew that taking away our identity, taking away things from us to make us feel less than, to have us have worthiness issues, and our value would keep us small, would keep us in these places where we couldn't grow, that we would be stagnant. But it was reclaiming my roots and reconnecting with my ancestry that actually helped me to heal on levels that I can't even explain. When I was in El Salvador, I got the amazing opportunity to go to some ruins, a handful of ruins, and just being there and walking around barefoot just made me realize there were so many parts of me that had been broken apart. And it was as though this puzzle piece just automatically came back together. I have no words for this. And it was reflecting on my indigenous roots and my ancestors. They were the OG, like the OG manifestors. They would utilize the stars, the planets, the earth elements to manifest the crap out of stuff, right? They were so connected to the earth, so connected. And how badass is that? And we still have these capabilities. We still have this part of us, even in this modern day. We still have this ability, even in this modern day, even with the layered wounding from our past experience, personal experiences, and our collective experiences. I acknowledge, as a manifestation coach, this all runs really, really deep. All this information that I'm unpacking here in this episode. If you identify as BIPOC, you have these different experiences and you have different wounding than maybe the white counterparts. I completely understand that. I understand that to my core because I've personally experienced that myself. And I continuously unpack these things. And for that reason, I choose to tailor my teachings to incorporate these different aspects because I am BIPOC and because I am a woman of color and I have struggled and I have had very similar experiences, even though my upbringing may be different than yours. My experiences that I've had in this particular lifetime, and of course, the experiences that my body and my DNA has gone through in different lifetimes, I understand. And before, to be honest with you, I was actually very concerned about talking about this because I felt like there's not a place for this kind of conversation in the spiritual spaces and the manifesting spaces. But now I realize that I cannot keep these teachings to myself. I can't come from a place of ignorance. I can't come from a place of not having this be integrated in the way that I speak, in the way that I teach, in the way that I share. Because just like what I said, I would have been denying this part of me. And like I said, denying parts of you is actually keeping you from your manifestations. So accessing the whole parts of you, whatever it is that you identify as, those are the ways in which you are able to fully tap into your manifestation abilities. I lightly touch upon all of this in my program, Activate Your Inner Wealth and Abundance workshop. I share how the scarcity wounds is not your fault. We have been colonized in a certain way, and we've been led to believe certain things. There is a larger organ that's at play. Yes, 111%, there are systemic barriers to wealth and opportunities. We have collectively manifested that. Manifestation is a creation. And so we're constantly creating with our minds. And so if we are collectively creating this reality, then it is part of the reality that we're living in. So the barriers to wealth and opportunities are very, very present in our society. And it feels as though when you're BIPOC, it feels as though it's harder. It's harder to understand. It's harder to catch up. It's harder to become. It is that we see as successful. And it feels like we're not getting there fast enough as a collective, that we haven't figured it out somehow. Going back to what I said before, really understanding that it starts with you. And again, I'm not saying this in the way to bypass any of the things that you've experienced, but I truly, truly believe it starts with you. And this program, one of the things that I point out to you, it's not your fault that you have been led to believe that you are unworthy and that you have a scarcity wound. It's because you've been taught that. And so this program will help detangle a little bit of your self-worth from what you've been led to believe. Since I've discovered the tie between my worth and reclaiming my roots and manifestation, since I've discovered this connection or correlation between my worth, reclaiming my roots, and manifesting, I feel like this is the missing link that really sets all of this into play. It's the chain reaction that I personally needed to help me intentionally manifest with more ease. Since I came back from El Salvador in April, it has been nothing but more ease. It's been nothing but just an amazing new chapter. And again, it's hard for me to articulate in words other than what I've reflected into this episode, that there's a tie here. And that's what's exciting, is I get to unpack this a lot more as I go and as I progress in my journey and experience more. So there's a lot more to unpack. There's a lot more to discover. There's a lot more to talk about. But this is just the beginning of a conversation that I find very fascinating. And again, you can rely on me because of who I am as a person. And these are my particular interests that I'm going to bring and tie in together race and gender into manifestation. Because the experience that we have on this planet as somebody that is not the majority, right? Who was of the colonized. And again, I'm speaking more specifically in the United States because that has been my experience, right? That has been my experience, is growing up in the United States is a very, very large topic. We have a very deep rooted history. These things are important because it's how you experience life. And it's important because it's who you are as a person. And it's important because you're here to experience life in human form. And yes, we are spiritual beings, and also navigating and untethering ourselves from what would be considered reality or accepted reality. Let's call it accepted reality, because many of us don't want to accept that as reality. We feel like it's not just or correct or good, but it is our collective reality. And what we know around subconscious and doing inner work, we can change reality. And again, it starts with you. Thank you so much for your patience in all of this. It's been an interesting topic to discover. I desire to be a very conscious spiritual thought leader because of the platform that I have. And also, I really hope that this gave you some level of insight on some things maybe you weren't even thinking about when it came to manifestation and spirituality and being BIPOC. Please share this episode with somebody, because I want more people to start thinking like this. It's against the grain for sure. It is very against the grain. And like I said, this episode probably ruffles some feathers. I might likely get some unfollows. There might be people that just be like, I don't want to hear this from a spiritual leader. I don't want to hear this from a manifestation coach. However, there are people that are going to be so grateful that they heard this episode because they finally have found somebody who understands. And I attempt to understand because I'm constantly attempting to understand myself. and my journey. And so when I'm doing that, of course, as an empathetic human being, I am understanding your journey and helping you through your journey. So please make sure to share this episode with somebody. If you found this episode even so much more amazing than you thought it would be, make sure to take a screenshot of the episode and send it to me, or tag me in it, on Instagram or Facebook at Sarita Wellness. And as a thank you, I'm actually going to send you a wealth hypnosis, because I really feel that hypnosis is such a great way to assist with starting to uncover, unpack a lot of those blocks that we may have or been subjected with. Remember, we've been subjected to believe to be true, which are not true. So yes, make sure to take a screenshot of the episode, tag me at Sarita Wellness, and I will send me actually, so I know, because sometimes I'll miss stuff. Make sure to email me info@saritawellness.com and let me know that you screenshotted it and tagged me in it. And then I will send you personally the wealth hypnosis to your email. Again, thank you so much for being here in this episode. I love talking about these things. We will see you in the next one. Have a great rest of your day and keep being the amazing you that you are. Take care. Hey love, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. If you adored what you heard, it would mean the world to me if you took a moment to leave a review on the platform you are listening to this episode on. By doing this, you are helping my mission to impact other women with their healing journeys. If you aren't already following me on social media, make sure to connect with me at Sarita Wellness to get your weekly dose of inspiration. I can't wait to be with you in the next episode, but in the meantime, keep being the amazing you that you are.